Welcome to Conservation Connection, the show where each week we do exactly what it sounds like, connect you to people working in the field of conservation. I'm Sarah Catherine.
And I'm Chance.
If you were an animal, would you be a rattlesnake or a gopher tortoise?
Ooh, that's an excellent question. If I were an animal, would I be a rattlesnake or a gopher tortoise?
I guess it's not giving you much choice because you can't choose like any animal, but...
No. That's an important distinction.
Generally, would you be a rattlesnake or a gopher tortoise?
Because like on the one hand, gopher tortoises are environmental engineers. They're super important. Hundreds of species rely on them. On the other hand, snake, which like I love rattlesnake. I love snakes in general, and rattlesnakes are pretty cool. So I'm going to have to probably go with rattlesnake. It feels a little more Texan.
Yeah.
It just feels right. Although you are definitely a gopher tortoise.
Yeah. For sure. I like how you gave a lot of thought into why it would be great to be a gopher tortoise.
Well, yeah, they're freaking cool.
The justification for rattlesnake was just snake.
Well, okay, yeah. I mean, but you know me. Ooh, although I didn't consider this, that gopher tortoises attract indigo snakes, which are probably the coolest snake in America, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, you just like share an apartment with an indigo snake.
Yeah, that'd be dope.
Anyway, this is all relevant to our upcoming episode and ties us in with our last episode too.
Yeah, so this week we had an awesome conversation with Dr. Barbara Blonder. She is a professor at Flagler College in St. Augustine. What did she describe herself as? A disturbance ecologist?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like somebody who's looking at how ecosystems respond to disturbance. And we actually have a really cool conversation about why disturbance in the form of like fire is really important to ecosystems, but also how other disturbances that you're not adapted to can be really detrimental.
Yeah, I always love when we get the chance to talk to our guest about fire and why it's so important to an environment. A lot of our listeners probably know and have maybe heard on the show before that, you know, fire is important to the environment. We actually even talked about it in our last episode last week with rattlesnakes and, you know, having that disturbance. It's just a natural thing. I mean, before like we were here and had towns built everywhere and everything, fire just happened and it kind of reset the landscape, and it's needed for the environment and still is today.
Right. It's part of that natural cycle where nutrients turn into organisms, and then organisms turn back into nutrients when they burn or die and decompose, and it allows this cycle to continue. So yeah, this is a neat discussion on fire. And then the other twist on this is that gopher tortoises are not just inland species in like a longleaf pine ecosystem, but they also live in what we call the coastal strand, which is that chunk of vegetation between sandy beach, literally like ocean, then sand, then vegetation, all the way to trees. That little strip of land, we call that the coastal strand, and it is prime habitat for gopher tortoises. But they've got a whole different set of pressures that they have to respond to when you're living by the ocean. And so, yeah, it's really a fun episode. We get into that, and we get into how she took all of this scientific knowledge and is using it as a politician, actually, right?
Yeah, so she is the city commissioner of St. Augustine, Florida, which was a really interesting topic to discuss with her, being both a scientist and a politician. She has some really fun thoughts on like the intersection of science and politics that you get to hear towards the end of this episode. And it was just a really fun conversation.
Yeah, it's neat because it's like, you know, I guess the eternal issue that we deal with in this field is like, what can we do about it, right? How can we help? How can we solve the problem? And her response to that was like, I'm going to get involved in my local community as an elected official, and we're going to do things like pass speed limits in waterways to reduce manatee boat strikes. Like, that's something that we talk about. I think everybody solves problems in their own way, and it's neat to see somebody who is creating knowledge and then using that knowledge to make management decisions. I think that's really neat.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to bring up a few like housekeeping things, I guess you would call it here. If you are watching the reel that we post on our Instagram along with this episode release, you will see our lovely branded shirts that we're so excited to have now. If you want one, you can send us an email, message us on Instagram. They're super comfortable.
Well, yeah, they're comfort colors, so they're like great t-shirts. We also have some excellent reusable metal cups that have a really neat Listen for a Better World logo on it, which is the same logo that's on the back of the shirt. So if you guys are interested, you can reach out to us on Instagram, where you're probably watching this reel, and let us know.
We also had a great response to last week's episode on rattlesnakes. Super exciting to see such a great response for the beginning of this season. We got a few more reviews, which is always really exciting to see. So thank you to everyone who's listening and leaving reviews. We really appreciate you guys. And keep, sharing it with your friends, letting them know we're out there. And we're also very excited because in 2 weeks, we will be at EarthX in Dallas, Texas. So just as a reminder, if you are in Dallas or going to be in Dallas,
April 21st through April 26th.
Yeah, we will be there. So reach out to us. We'd love to see you.
Yeah, it would be super fun if we get some interest to meet up somewhere and catch a drink with anybody who listens to the show. We'd love to see you guys in Dallas.
So that's enough housekeeping. We have a really exciting episode coming up that I hope all of you will love with Dr. Barbara Blonder from Flagler College. Let's get to the show.
Get ready to learn about some gopher tortoises.
All right, so today we're here with Professor Barbara Blonder at Flagler College. We are so excited to have you on the show, and I just want to dive right in and talk about kind of how long you've been here at Flagler College and the research you've been doing since you were here.
Thank you. Okay, well, so I'll start with, you said, how long have I been here? And this is coming up quickly on my 21st anniversary teaching here at Flagler College. And some of the projects I've been working on, really it all stems from our emphasis on undergraduate research as a requirement for our coastal environmental science major. We have a living laboratory all around us. The Guanatolomado-Matanzas National Estuarine Research Reserve basically surrounds us. And when we were launching the major, we realized we really don't have the actual infrastructure in place in terms of laboratories, building space, but we have this entire living laboratory surrounding us. So that's how we got into undergraduate research. And as we were doing that, it led to an opportunity for our students to participate in faculty-led research, formally or informally. So when I got my first sabbatical, I knew I needed hands and people and brains, people who were willing to do the hard work in the field. And I couldn't do it by myself. There was just no way. So in thinking about fire ecology and coastal ecosystems, I recruited 4 of my students who had been participating with me in smaller projects, and they were instrumental in helping make that happen. So, and actually getting the research done. So that was the first real big research project I had. It came from the Guana Reserve and its prescribed fire program, doing a prescribed fire in the coastal strand ecosystem. And I started looking at the literature and just looking at the pictures, the flame heights were incredibly high, akin to what we call scrub in inland ecosystems, really intense fire. And I started thinking about it, and I went into the literature, and there's almost no literature on fire ecology in coastal systems. So that was a kind of the launch. Okay, well, if there's not much going on,
maybe I can look into that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that's how science works, right? It's like, what do we not know? What can I not find information on? And let's go collect that data and analyze it.
I mean, it really stems from an observation. Hey, they did fire in coastal ecosystem. I haven't seen that before, even though I'd been doing fire ecology in inland ecosystems for years before that. So,
which is actually kind of the thread that I want to hang this episode on, is this balance between disturbance-reliant ecosystems inland, like a longleaf pine ecosystem, and how disturbance acts on coastal ecosystems here.
Okay. So I think the important thing to do is say, first of all, I'm a disturbance ecologist. I've evolved into a disturbance ecologist. Okay, what is disturbance ecology? That's anything that impacts an ecosystem. It's an event that impacts an ecosystem. So typically it's thought of as natural disturbance. We know anthropogenic disturbance, which is human-caused disturbance. You know, deforest an area, or and convert it into a farm, or you pave it over and make a highway,
or an oil spill.
An oil spill. Any of those are human-caused disturbances. Natural disturbances are things like hurricanes. They're things like tornadoes and fire. In the literature, it's also called pulse disturbances, and that pulse is that event type. Some are predictable and some aren't. And sea level rise has become it's part of that disturbance cycle. And so that's part of what's affecting coastal ecosystems.
So from the outside, if I'm thinking about it, disturbance does not ever sound like a good thing. But that's not necessarily the case, right?
In fact, it's essential for the maintenance of a lot of ecosystems. So when you think about wildfire, wildfire is just fire that happens that nobody decided should happen at that time.
Yeah.
So lightning strike or drought or whatever might be the case. Fire is absolutely essential for the maintenance of many of the most threatened ecosystems globally. And if you take it down to Florida, it is essential for our most threatened ecosystems, longleaf pine, wiregrass, like you said, for example, but also scrub. And so earlier on in my career, I went literally from water to fire, going from spiny lobster research to fire ecology. Yeah. But I learned a lot about the benefits and planning for prescribed fire. I really got charged up about it. Really, really enjoyed it. It's one of the most gratifying things I've ever done in terms of being a scientist is you put fire on the land and you watch all the different organisms that you thought might be negatively impacted. The rattlesnakes and stuff are going into the fire as soon as it's cooled enough. So it's like 15 minutes after the fire passes, looking for an easy meal coming out. So they're well adapted to it. Gopher tortoises, everybody dives into gopher tortoise burrows, whether it be frogs or rabbits or whatever, so to let the fire pass. So
yeah, I bet the gopher tortoises are like, hi, welcome
to
neighbors.
my burrow, all 300 different species of you that might use them.
Right.
I suppose you could hang out while this fire passes by.
Yeah,
sure.
we can just come to an accord and then go our separate ways.
Right.
But then seeing like these endangered plant species pop up and flower within weeks after a fire, it's super cool.
Yeah.
It's really gratifying.
And I think that's like something so often when you hear about wildfires, forest fires, all of that stuff, you hear about like California or a lot of like our western states that they naturally occur from like lightning strikes or something like that. But whether they naturally occur or not, the reason they're so big is because we don't have controlled burns in a lot of those places. And so like everything is just grown and grown and grown, and you have all of this fuel and it creates this huge disaster. And so when you think about like wildfires, forest fires, I think a lot of people think about them as a bad thing because that's how you typically hear about them in the news is like, oh, all these people are losing their homes. Like these trees are all burning down. They're all dead now. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is it is a natural part of like
so
that
many landscapes.
Ecosystem. Yeah. And without us here, like it just naturally occurred and happened. But with people here now, like being like, oh, we have to prevent the fires, and like not intentionally burn. So like that fuel does just like build and build and build. And that's why it gets so out of hand. But it sounds like that's kind of something you're working on is like studying specifically like, okay, now we have these intentional fires that we're like burning in these coastal ecosystems so they don't just like this brush doesn't build and build and then everything gets destroyed.
Yeah. And I will say, I mean, people's lives are ruined and in fact, people die in these fires. So, but what really it comes down to is humans in places that used to burn regularly, that need to burn regularly, whether long time spans in between or not. But at the same time, this is what I like about it is that the conversation is starting to shift to the need for prescribed fire to manage those fuel loads and to keep from having these extreme firestorms that are uncontrollable. And so states like Florida have been at the forefront of applying fire science for years and years and years. It comes from our culture, the cracker, the Florida crackers, really, and the indigenous peoples before that using fire. And so now a lot of that knowledge is being shared throughout other states. And yeah, so hopefully we'll start seeing more prescribed fire. A good fire, is better than an unexpected fire.
And we're really trying to change public perceptions.
Yes.
Is one of the really big things is, so many people today grew up with, only you can prevent wildfires. That Smokey the Bear, all fire is bad. And at the end of the day, it is going to burn whether you want it to or not. It will eventually catch fire. So getting ahead of it, lighting it when the fuel load is low and the flames are low and pass through quickly, as opposed to burning at a heat that's so intense it's going to kill mature pine trees and mature vegetation, that's the difference. These periodic fires that are a lot more manageable and healthy. And so can you talk a little bit about mechanically, why is fire good for the ecosystem in terms of it helps seed germination or nutrient dispersal, or what are some of the major benefits for ecosystems that
all of that? You can think about it from a lot of different levels. So I'll just give a short list. One, like you said, it's seed germination for some species. Some species require that type of heat in order to be able to germinate. Others, a lot of it is about nutrient cycling. All of the nutrients that are locked up into the vegetation as it grows. When the vegetation burns, then it is recycled back into the soil and becomes available as free nutrients for the next recovery of plants in that ecosystem. Also, there's this whole term about ecological succession where over time, if you were to have your lawn, like mine, I don't mow it very often. And so you start seeing little, shrubs come up and so forth. And if you don't mow it for a lot longer, say an open field where somebody, has an empty lot, then eventually you get little saplings and so on and so forth over time. And it's no longer grass. And so having those different stages of succession actually enables greater diversity in the plant species, animal species that are dependent on those plants and so forth.
There's more niches available to fill,
exactly.
Right? There's more opportunities to survive.
Exactly. And so that fire kind of resets the successional time clock and so reduces shading, reduces competition for nutrients and so on and so forth. So those are the first things that come to my mind about those benefits.
So to kind of move into what sort of our model organism for the episode, talking about gopher tortoises, which are super cool organisms. I know them mostly from an inland aspect, nowhere near the coast, along the coastal plain, which is still a sandy ecosystem, but definitely not somewhere that's going to become inundated with seawater. Yeah. They're really well studied in this inland context. What are some of their benefits in an ecosystem?
Many.
They're pretty cool.
Well, they're burrowing, which is why they're called gopher tortoises. They're fairly large. They're long-lived, and they're herbivores, so they eat vegetation. They love fire because their burrows protect them from the fire. But as soon as the fire passes, you've got within a week nice, fresh, tender vegetation, the best of the best. So they're actually fire dependent in order to be able to survive. What they contribute to ecosystems is actually by maintaining those burrows, they're taking soils that are, long buried and kind of recharging them and moving them to the surface and so forth.
Sort of like a giant earthworm, where the earthworm is going down and just moving things around.
Very large earthworm.
Those burrows host up to 300 different species that coexist with the gopher tortoises in some way, shape, or form, including some really endangered species like indigo snakes and gopher frogs and gopher crickets and stuff like that. So they're not intentionally, but they have a lot of other, they basically are like providing housing for lots of different species. Some species require the open sand nature of the apron, the entrance to the burrow, in order to be able to incubate their eggs. And so,
Interesting.
Like
yes,
what species?
some I couldn't name off the top of my head, but some bird species in particular.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Use that as a nesting site.
Yeah.
Wow.
We were
Yeah.
actually just over, so we live in Columbus, Georgia, and close to there we have,
So right at the fall line.
Yeah.
we have Sandhills WMA Wildlife Management Area, and for my 30th birthday, we went over there and like walked around because a friend had just run a story on the area and the longleaf pine ecosystem and trying to help the gopher tortoises over there and stuff, and found some gopher tortoise burrows. And they had like just burned there. So you could see it was like very fresh burn. And we found some eggs at the entrance to these burrows. And so we were like, oh, I wonder if these are gopher tortoise eggs. But now that you're saying this, I'm like, maybe they were birds. Maybe they were like anything else. I don't know what they were.
The tortoises will also lay their eggs.
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
those
And they were
aprons,
just shell fragments, to be clear. They
Yeah.
weren't like full
Yeah.
eggs.
Oh, yeah,
but-
they were
yeah.
just shell fragments. So there was like no way of telling how big they had been or anything. But that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah, they're just really interesting organisms, and we call them keystone species because they are critical to the survival of so many other species. And so without them, then those other species are threatened with, extirpation, or at least not being found in those areas anymore.
Right.
Yeah,
So if you'll go on this thought exercise with me,
sure.
if you could imagine for us that sitting on this desk between us is a gopher tortoise, you can kind of visualize it. Could you describe it for our audience that's listening about like, just what is it to look at a gopher tortoise that's sitting in front of you?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they think of the coast especially, they think of sea turtles probably.
Yeah.
That's always what I thought until in 2018 we came down here and went on a tour and like walked around. They were like, these are gopher tortoise burrows. I was like, what is that?
Yeah, they're super cool. Well, everybody knows what a turtle looks like, right? And
Right.
So turtles are, they spend a lot of their lives in water. Tortoises, very similar looking, but they don't do water too much. They require fresh water, of course. But we will find a gopher tortoise swimming every now and then out in the ocean. In
my
fact, I have never seen it, but I've heard incredible reports of this. And the thought is that that they are subject to ticks. And other parasites, and so they might go for a swim every now and then. But we have a lot of people who live here on the coast who see a gopher tortoise in the beach dunes and assume it's a sea turtle,
Right.
which has a much flatter shell. So that's part of your thought experiment description here. Tortoises, I think, gopher tortoises are kind of rounder. But anyway, these people will mistakenly think these are sea turtles and put them in
Take
the
them-
ocean.
oh,
And the
no.
gopher tortoises are like, no, I just got rid of those ticks. I don't
Oh,
want
no.
to go back in. I'm not good at swimming. Anyway, but they're more rounded. They're when they're adults, they're 18 inches across and about the same in terms of length, and they're just cute. They've got really cute faces, and they are fun to watch. As
They look like grizzled old men. As soon as they're born, they always to me
yeah.
look like they've just seen decades of
Yeah.
wisdom pass by.
Yeah. The really small ones, when they're first hatched, are adorable. They're a little bit more colorful than the wizened old adults.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah.
They're super cool. I had never heard about reports of gopher tortoises entering the ocean, but
Oh.
it makes me think of a passage from David Quammen's Song of the Dodo.
Oh, love that book.
Of course you do.
And that
'cause
writer.
yeah.
And that writer.
But he talks about why are there giant tortoises, on the Galapagos Islands, and it's because they float. The same reason that there's coconuts across the world is that they floated there. These giant tortoises were able to, or tortoises that were probably not quite as large when they were making these journeys, probably got washed out to sea during a hurricane or something like that and floated until they found another island, were able to crawl out, and they had enough, body fat reserves and whatever to survive that journey. So the idea that a land-based tortoise like the gopher tortoise would also occasionally enter the ocean intentionally, it like you just connected like 6 light bulbs in my brain. That's so cool.
That's super cool. I hope it's true. I've never seen it.
I've heard reports.
I've heard from other scientists who have seen it.
Well, I mean, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
You don't have the dexterity to remove parasites yourself, and you're not always going to be seeking out some sort of a commensal bird to help you with it. If it gets bad enough, you'll try just about anything. I mean, I would, I have done wild things to avoid gnats and mosquitoes when I'm out in the field. So
Just
I'm
run into the ocean.
smear myself with pluff mud. I've done a lot.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I hope it's true, because that gives me hope that maybe I'll see it one day.
Yeah, me too, for that matter. Sure.
So you said that you've kind of transitioned from like water to fire, but then your most recent research, the most recent one that I found, had to do with hurricanes. So you're kind of back to water again.
Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way. So what happened was we were doing the research on fire ecology and the coastal ecosystems around Northeast Florida. And as we were out there on the dunes, walking miles every day, became apparent that there's a whole lot of gopher tortoises there. And the Guanatolomado Matanzas National Estuarine Research Reserve.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, I know, it is a mouthful. They had been doing pretty much annual gopher tortoise surveys for as long as I know of. And we were out there, and I volunteered for us to go ahead and add in, while we were surveying the vegetative response to fire, also just do a survey of the gopher tortoise burrows. Where are they? Mapped them using GPS, and what activity level. So for gopher tortoise research, gopher tortoises will often use more than one burrow depending on the time of year and whatever else reasons they do. So their burrows can be very active. In other words, they're in their burrow, they're coming out every day during the growing season and eating whatever they can and then going back in the burrow to hide during the hot part of the day. But other times they will dig a burrow and leave it and then come back to it later. So that's another type of level of activity that is monitored inactive. And then sometimes they'll just abandon a burrow and nobody will want that one anymore. Maybe because it floods in the coastal strand because of hurricanes. So
there's sort of these 3 levels. There's active, inactive, and abandoned.
Yeah.
And as you're walking through the dunes, you're noticing the burrows, marking down where they are and what the state of the burrow is.
Yeah. And so we had all these data, and we shared it with the Guana Research Reserve staff and said, here's the status of your gopher tortoise population in the coastal dunes. And, they monitor it long term to see if it's increasing, decreasing, whatever. So we had that. So we had a full season of the vegetative work and then of the gopher tortoise burrow locations and activity. And then Hurricane Matthew hit right after. We gathered those data. So then the serendipitous question comes up. Where did the gopher tortoises go? My prediction had been that a lot of them had been wiped out, just drowned in their burrows. What we found, though, is that a lot of the inactive and abandoned burrows that were categorized as such in the previous year were no longer inactive or abandoned. We had a lot more active burrows. So we think that the gopher tortoises actually left the lower elevation burrows that they might have liked better and went up to higher elevation burrows that were no longer being used. Or they might have shacked up with each other.
Interesting.
Yeah, we're not really sure, but we did notice a big shift, a significant shift in the percentage of active burrows.
And also in their density, right?
Yeah.
They were more closely clustered together.
Yeah.
Which makes sense when, there's going to be some loss of burrows due to erosion or flooding or whatever. So there's fewer burrows to choose from overall. But that brings the whole population closer together.
Yeah.
In the aftermath of that, right?
Right, exactly. And so that comes as a two-edged sword. Okay, it's easier to hang out with your neighbor or find a mate, but there's more competition for limited resources. Where are the plants? So if you get a hurricane, especially back-to-back hurricanes like we did 2 years in a row, the plants that the gopher tortoises prefer to eat, are more healthy for them, are not there. And so we haven't done that work yet. We're working on that to see what they were eating in the interim. But they're competing with each other for that limited, it's kind of like during the pandemic when everybody was trying to get the Frosted Flakes because those were the best cereal, and you end up with the Wheaties or whatever store brand that nobody wanted. It's kind of, that's how I think about it.
Right,
There's not a whole lot of choice on the shelves. Then you get the other part of that density issue, which is because they're closer together, just like humans, there's more possibility for transmission of disease. And then finally, there's this whole concept called coastal squeeze, where humans love coastal environments. That's where our densest populations are. And we have our roads and we have our houses and our shopping centers and everything else. And the gopher tortoises and other organisms that are coastal, found in coastal ecosystems are squeezed into smaller and smaller spaces just from human development. Then you add in sea level rise. And, then you've got very little land left.
Yeah, I was reading, your description of this site in the literature, and it talks about how it's literally boxed in, on the eastern edge is ocean. You've got, I think it was developments on the north and south edge, and then the western edge was A1A, which a gopher tortoise is not going to be able to cross.
Right, not without getting smashed, by a car. Yeah.
And so in these cases of these, would you call them pulse disturbances? Like a hurricane. It comes in and here's this periodic, really destructive natural experience. The tortoises don't have anywhere to go other than the best possible habitat within this relatively small ecosystem, right? I think how big was the study site?
Oh, I forget now. I'm sorry.
I think it was something like 55 hectares or something?
That sounds exactly right. Yeah.
So it was not, that's not a huge amount of space. To put it in American terms, that's like, 70 football fields? Something in that world? I think I did these calculations properly on the way over. But, it's a functioning ecosystem, but it's not like massive. You can't get miles inland to get away from even a moderate storm surge.
Yeah. And so, you think about the gopher tortoise having that challenge, and then all the other burrow commensals is what we call them, the other species that hang out and are dependent on gopher tortoise burrows. So all of them are facing, all over the world, this coastal squeeze and coastal ecosystems.
Yeah. I have so many thoughts just on the whole, a hurricane's coming and we all go kind of more inland. And without anthropomorphizing the gopher tortoises, giving them human characteristics and human thoughts, it's like, are they creating these burrows kind of like people, where it's like, I want to live on the coast, but if a hurricane comes, I'll go here. They say animals can sense hurricanes, tornadoes, that kind of stuff, and kind of move to protect themselves. So
that's exactly what I was thinking, because it was like you were talking about them having these secondary burrows that are not their primary.
That you thought were abandoned.
Right, or at least inactive.
Yeah.
And were those made
for this situation?
For the situation of a possible inundation, or I don't think that we know that.
I would, that's a speculation, but it sure is handy to have them.
Definitely.
And I would, it would just seem to me that you're right. They must sense the salt spray and everything else coming at them, the increased wind, the change in barometric pressure, whatever it might be. And they're like, I'd better get out of this low-lying burrow and get up to safe ground.
It makes me wonder if there is, because we kind of talk about coastal populations of the gopher tortoise and inland populations of the gopher tortoise that live, very similar lifestyles, but in different ecosystems. It makes me wonder if there is a difference in the average number of burrows that a adult tortoise uses or maintains over the course of a year, and if we would see more burrows in a coastal ecosystem where you might need to have a bug out burrow that you can get to that's in higher ground. That's just where I would want to start asking these questions.
Yeah, sure. There's tons of questions. Yeah, there really are.
And I think that's one of my favorite things about science, is that I think a lot of times, I don't know, for me as somebody that, trained as a scientist, but also has always been interested in the history of science over the past, 500 years, I kind of sometimes get like this false nostalgia for like being on the Beagle and just going out and like, I'm just going to go collect a bunch of specimens and then spend the next 30 years examining them as this sort of the golden age of science, where we're doing a lot of baseline stuff. But it's easy to forget that there are so many questions that we still don't have the answers to today, and we have such better technology to investigate those questions with precision.
Yeah, I don't really have a nostalgia for that day, but I mean, because of the discovery science, the serendipity, the serendipitous nature of science. The recent research I've been doing is all like, okay, this happened. Now I have questions, and
Right.
I think that's the case. There's a lot of job security as a scientist.
There are always more questions to be answered.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to bring us into our next little section here, I always like to talk about like, what do we do, right? How do we help protect the tortoise? How do we help protect these ecosystems that are under this coastal squeeze, like you were talking about? And I think it's very interesting that your response to that, and some of your students' suggestion response to that, is that you got involved in local government here in the area, right?
And you ran as city commissioner.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so let me try to recall this. I think I was reading an article that someone did interviewing you about like how you became city commissioner and all of that. And it was your students who suggested you run, correct?
Yeah.
That's so
Yeah.
cool. I love that.
Yeah. Well, it just happened organically.
Yeah.
But I had a really interesting group of it was a diverse class, diverse thoughts, diverse majors, diverse racially, like all kinds of different ways diverse. And it was in intro to environmental science. And we were having some really cool class discussions. And I like to teach in a way like, here's our problems, here's our challenges, and here's what we can do individually and collectively. Here are some possible solutions. And so we were engaged in that process and throughout the semester. And then one day they just kind of had enough. I think they got to the threshold of this is too many challenges. And one of them said to me, Destiny, within the class discussion, I kind of just want to curl up in a ball and stay in bed, and what else can we do? And I said, well, I changed careers, thought to myself, I changed careers and went from nonprofit work in conservation to education to try to leverage this whole idea about raising awareness, and therefore building capacity for addressing our environmental challenges. And so I love education, and she made that statement, and I'm like, well, people have been bugging me to run for office. And I've been saying, no way, no way, no way. I guess that's something I could consider doing. And they're like, yeah, we'll help you. So, so that's how it happened. And
that's amazing.
And in politics, we don't have a lot of scientists who, no, I don't know any. Really, I don't mean to say it in a negative way, but not many people want to be politicians. So, consider it something that is distasteful or whatever. And I'm no different, like I didn't have that, hey, I want to be a politician,
Right.
as a goal. But when I thought about how a scientist can change the narrative, how a scientist, if I'm doing my job right, can actually communicate the science effectively and gain support for making change, with our citizens. It's working. It's super cool. And people are loving, bringing that conversation to our how we define ourselves as a city. Mm-hmm. And I just really hope that these words are heard by somebody else who gets inspired by this, because I really, really enjoy being a politician, not all of it. It's like I love being an educator until I have to grade all weekend. But I really like that the narrative is changing, that we're really focused on issues that require scientific information, credible scientific information, in order to determine how we're going to address them, whether it be coastal flooding from sea level rise, or whether it be any number of things like the pace of development and saving some green space. And so now we have a conservation and resilience land acquisition program that's rolling out right now as we speak.
That's amazing.
It's super cool. And we're just a little city of 15,000 people.
That's so cool. This is such a cool city. And I think like there's so much potential for like some really amazing things.
Yeah, I wanted to say this is the city of St. Augustine, by the way, because we haven't said that.
We said we were at Flagler College, but yes, Flagler College.
It's the city of St. Augustine, which is the nation's oldest city, 1565 and all this. So it's this history, it's this incredible natural environment that has defined us and it's continuing to define us with the challenges that we have.
Some of my favorite communities are communities that are really in touch with the lifeblood of why that community exists in the space that it exists. Like for us in Columbus, Georgia, we live on the Chattahoochee River at the fall line. It is where the water has a ton of energy. The first peoples of America used it as a place to gather food from because it's just a weird place for nutrients to accumulate and the water begins to slow. But beyond that, it was a place for textile mills that could take the energy of that water and use it for industry. And it's a city that is built around this natural resource. And so I think that in many ways that just weaves itself into the culture of an area. And so to see someplace like St. Augustine that is, really taking steps with you at the helm to some degree.
Only in the environmental arena.
in the environmental arena.
Yeah.
It is really neat. I really like to see that. And I mean, I guess I'm just saying I knew there was a reason that I like St. Augustine.
There's plenty of reasons. But I mean, Flagler College is right in the heart of the city. And so having that opportunity to bring examples from my own research and my own work and communicating science and educating into city government, and then conversely taking what I learned in city government about policy and how to work with people across political boundaries, that's really cool because that's one of our biggest challenges right now. And so bring that back into the classroom. It's super cool to be able to go back and forth between the two worlds and connect them. And that's why we're sitting here today, in part, I think, so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And like for your students to have like such a cool professor to be like, oh yeah, I'm also the city commissioner and like these are the things we're doing, and like talk to your students about them and show them that intersection between, politics and science and research. I think that's really cool. And how long have you been the city commissioner?
I've been a city commissioner going on 4 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
And I'll give you an example. One of my students, I require them to do a semester-long project on some environmental issue. And she chose to look at how to reduce the number of boat strikes on manatees, sea turtles, and marine mammals in our estuary, and came up with a pitch to establish a slow and no-wake speed zone in an area that we have a higher concentration of all of these animals. And she brought it to the city commission. And we passed that.
Nice.
And it's now in effect. The signs are out there and it's being.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's neat to be able to. I mean, you're a 20-something person, right? And then you're like, hey, I just got something serious done, about something I care about.
Yeah.
There's a lot of power there.
That's so cool. And I think for a really long time, science was thought of and taught as this sort of impassive thing of like, we create knowledge and we give it to the people who then use that knowledge to make decisions. And in order to create the best knowledge possible, we are not involving ourselves in those decisions so that we're not biased in any way. And there's been this super hard shift away from that into this like, we are the ones who are studying it. We're the experts in it. And it behooves us to make sure that information is communicated effectively and used effectively to bring about, positive things in the world. And your story is like that perfect storm of knowledge of what's happening locally, access to students who are learning and impressionable, and winning the election as the city commissioner in order to affect these changes. And so they kind of all inform each other. And it's just, I wish that I had that as an undergraduate. I had a professor that was really awesome about public communication, but we didn't do as much implementation in sort of like the public sphere. And I think it's a really important part of the puzzle.
Yeah, I like how you framed for me, what feels like a responsibility, where scientists have been really reluctant. We're supposed to be objective, like you said, and not get into advocacy or policy or whatever. And I think you can still walk that line. I try very hard to stay on the right side of that line, and stay with the facts, stay with the data. And use that as a tool for people to look at and say, hey, yeah, there is something here, and we do need to act on this. Yeah. So I thought you framed that really, really well. I feel it's a responsibility. I don't feel it's a responsibility for me to go to other levels of politics. I just really like the way we work at a local level. Mm-hmm. I think we are neighbors. We know each other personally in a small community. And to me, that's where my comfort level is.
Yeah.
And that's the core of communication, right? Is building relationships.
Right.
And that's when you can communicate effectively, is when you have a relationship with your audience. And so at a local level, you have that, your neighbors, your friends, you see each other outside of the context of, decision-making meetings or, public comments areas.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned about, hopefully someone hears this that maybe is like a scientist or kind of in this more like research background or education background, who doesn't feel like they have a political background, and it seems daunting to enter that sphere. How was that? I don't want to call it a transition because you're still teaching, you're still working here at Flagler at the same time, but how was that for you to say okay, I'm going to get into politics? Did you feel like you really had a background on politics? I feel even just me sitting here talking to you, I'm like, gosh, that would be so daunting. I feel like to be I'm going to run for a political office.
Yeah. I'm one of those super voters who votes in every election and hopes I don't get called up for jury duty. And that was literally, all the experience I had in politics is going and voting and deciding on which candidates I wanted to support. So, yeah, it was scary.
Yeah,
it was really scary. I didn't know what I was doing. And I did take a political science class from a colleague of mine to just kind of get my head into that world, because I'd never taken a political science class before. And then I asked a lot of questions, and I'm still making mistakes. I'll look back on a meeting and go, I should have done that differently, and then being willing to, I don't know, I'm a risk taker, and I learn from failure. And so it's well, if I run and I don't get elected, what's the loss? Some time, but I built a lot of great relationships with campaign team and others who supported me, and learned a lot about the process. So what's the worst that can happen? That, and so I guess that's really how, I would say that, don't be afraid to take a chance. If you really, if somebody, regardless of whether it's politics or whatever else it is, if you're passionate about something, then do it. Don't be afraid to try to make a difference.
Yeah. And you must enjoy it because you're running again, you told us.
Yeah.
So congratulations and good luck.
Thank you.
When is that election?
Both. It'll be the general election,
Okay.
Depending on how many other people file. But that's part of the process. There could be a primary. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
That makes
so
sense.
this
Cool.
year?
Yeah, it's this year. Yep, 2024 for sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I love it when I get to sit down and learn things. So thank you so much for the opportunity and for being on the show.
Likewise, I really, really enjoyed this. Thank you both for making the trip and taking the time. It's been a super cool experience.
I really love to see people who are taking action to protect the planet. There's a lot of people that we talk to who are scientists and are creating all this knowledge, but they don't always have the opportunity to take that next step and make changes in their community. And I think that's one of my favorite things about the story this week.
Yeah, it was a really cool story about how she got involved in politics, not knowing anything.
And having her students be like, oh, we should do this.
Yeah, just feeling, I think how a lot of us feel pretty often, it's just kind of like, it can feel like a lot. It can feel helpless and hopeless and like there is nothing to be done. And, I think this story just kind of shows that, hey, you can get out there and take action. Like, you don't have to wait for someone else to do it, kind of thing.
Yeah. So what she said about, like, if you're passionate about something, just try it. Take the risk. It's worth it because that's what life is all about. I really like that. Something that I'm going to try and fold into my life a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. Also, Gopher Tortoises. Always love a good Gopher Tortoise story. And, like, I'm just so curious about everything that we talked about in that episode with like, the hurricanes came and they went to these burrows that we thought were like uninhabited, pretty much, like just kind of abandoned. And I don't know. Are Gopher tortoises like us? They're like, oh, I'm going to build this burrow and if I need it, I'll come back to it.
Right. Like, do they build bunkers, basically?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's somebody's PhD thesis to figure out is like, do they act differently in different environments? But it could be my PhD thesis if I went back to school. I would love that. If you are listening and you're like, oh, I would love to research that, I would love to be involved, and I would also love to be on the publication. So just shoot me an email. Let's talk about it.
Speaking of talking about the episode, we are going to drop like on Spotify. There's a little Q&A box at the bottom. If you scroll down under the show, we're going to drop a question that just says, did you have any questions that you feel like weren't answered from this show that you want to know more about?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're not on Spotify, you can always just DM us on Instagram as well. But I would love to know what you guys are curious about from that episode. So feel free to reach out with that. I am more curious about the whole swimming tortoises thing.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
I want to see that.
Yeah, I want to see it too. I think that would be so cool to see.
So if you see that happening, take a video and send it to us.
But to be clear, do not put tortoises into the water.
Yeah, don't do that.
Let it be their choice. I think next week is going to be kind of a really cool, interesting continuation of this story because next week we're talking about Georgia's state marine mammal, which is the North Atlantic right whale, which it's a really interesting species because it's got a couple of distinct populations that have to be managed differently. But Kathy Saukus has been doing right whale surveys, North Atlantic right whale surveys for like 50 years. Yeah,
so she has a ton of experience with these animals and kind of just in like the ocean science field in general.
Yeah, I mean, she was so kind. She invited us into her home to record the episode, and she like made us a little plate of hors d'oeuvres and made us lunch. And this whole time she was chatting with us about her experience like running Gray's Reef National Marine Sanctuary, which is so freaking cool, and like her experience with NOAA and just like as a submersible vessel pilot. And like the whole time I was thinking we should be recording this for the podcast, but then the episode would be like 6 hours long.
Yeah, she had so many stories and was just really awesome to hang out with her and all of the cats that she has rescued that have been abandoned on her property. So yeah, I think that our listeners will get a kick out of that episode. It's always fun, I think, to talk about like these large marine mammals.
Yeah, you know, that charismatic megafauna that we talk about, right? Big, cool animals that we get to talk about. So yeah, it was a really cool conversation. I hope you guys can check it out next week. Next Tuesday will be our next episode. Have a good week.